It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
The whole truth and nothing but the truth.
After months of evidence giving, the first report of the COVID inquiry has been published. We'll bring you the very latest.
From today, the policy of this department is that the NHS is broken.
As Labour pledges to reform the health service, is the NHS resilient enough for another pandemic? The Prime Minister welcomes leaders from across Europe to a key summit at Blenheim Palace.
We want to work with all of you to reset relationships, rediscover our common interest and renew the bonds of trust and friendship.
And the Labour government set out its policy agenda yesterday. Does it signal a return to big state Britain? Joining us today, the Home Office Minister, Dame Angela Eagle. Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, Chris Philp. Dr Parth Patel from the Institute for Public Policy Research, a left-wing think tank. And the author and broadcaster, Tamandra Harkness. This is Politics Live. Well, a lot to talk about today. We're going to be bringing you the latest from the COVID inquiry very shortly. But I want to start with a little bit of a look at how the papers reacted to the King's speech yesterday. Of course, the Labour government laying out its policy priorities. Let's start with looking at some of the headlines. First, we have the Mirror. You can see here, taking back control is their headline. Then on to the Daily Express. We have Red Revolution. Bigger state and higher spending. And finally, the Daily Telegraph, Starmer unveils his big state Britain. So, Angela, as the Telegraph would style it, is big state Britain back?
Telegraph, those well-known speakers of truth. I don't think it's big state to want public service to work properly, to have rivers that aren't full of sewage, that have transport links that work properly, where there's good value for money, that has an NHS that's fit for purpose. There's nothing big state about that. I think that in the time that we spent on the stump in the election campaign, I think a lot of people were extremely frustrated that after years nothing really worked properly. So I think the King's speech was about ensuring that we begin to put that right and begin to change the direction that the country's going in. So, yeah, there will be employment rights, there'll be GB energy, we're going to have secure our borders with a border command, there's Hillsborough laws to get house building up and running properly, just to make our society fairer, more secure and actually make it work.
Chris?
Well, look, where there are things in there that we support or that we were working on previously, we will be constructive. So things like, Martin's Law following the Manchester Arena tragedy, things that were in the Criminal Justice Bill that I was taking through Parliament as a Home Office Minister
I think
just a few weeks ago.
I was chairing that one, Chris.
Yeah, you were, weren't you? That's
yes.
right, brilliantly,
yes.
I might add. So, I hope the elements of that bill to give the police more powers come forward, and we'll support it. The stuff on the cigarette smoking age, those are things that we will support. But there are also things in there that do concern us. And, they talked about getting growth going, increasing regulation of the employment market, giving trade unions more powers to go on strike. That won't encourage growth. It will actually inhibit growth. It'll reduce growth. So where we see things like those that will actually, in our view, not be in the national interest, and of course we'll oppose it.
Can I say, just on employment rights, we're at a stage now after 14 years of the Conservatives in office where being in work doesn't actually pay, and we've got a lot of in-work poverty. And so some of the changes in the employment rights bill are going to ban exploitative zero-hours contracts, we're going to make work pay, we're going to end fire and rehire. Just give people more security at work so they can begin to build. That is not giving trade unions more power and increasing costs.
Labour do also plan to roll back trade union laws. But hang on, zero-hours contracts are for some people, some workers, they have flexibility that the workers
exploitative zero-hours contracts.
And in terms of making work pay, it was the last government that increased the minimum wage from $5.93 to $11.44.
I want to focus on that idea of the big state. Tamandra, did it ever actually go away? The last government didn't really oversee a huge shrinking in the state, did it?
Well, this is what I think is so striking, is that some of these things which are being pointed to as big state, both in terms of things like renationalising the railways, well, the previous government had already started bringing some of the franchises back in-house, and certainly was taxing and spending possibly not even enough on public services. But then if you also look at the most intrusive measures, like the idea that you're going to raise the age of smoking progressively so that some people will never be able to smoke because of an arbitrary birthday, that was also introduced by the previous government. So otherwise you might have pointed to that and say, well, you know, this is a very authoritarian way to look at public health. But the previous government had introduced that as well.
Yeah.
So it's quite hard to see where the differences are, really.
Big states, just a continuation of the same thing.
I actually think we need to be a bit more demanding about how we're describing what we're seeing to better understand it, right? When we say big state, we usually think of the state spending more money as a share of GDP. That's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is greater state direction over the economy, right? You've got a government here that wants a particular type of growth. It wants growth from the bottom up and from the middle out. It wants to grow the economy, but also navigate an energy transition, a crisis in globalisation as usual. And they've said, in these choppier waters, we need a more active captain. We saw three things yesterday. We saw greater public investment, or commitment to greater public investment in GP Energy, the National Wealth Fund. We saw greater public ownership over critical infrastructure like railways. And we saw the use of the law to give a bigger slice of the pie to workers, to change planning. That's a very different kind of state governance. That's what we're seeing. And it's it's quite different to the past 40 years. It's the state isn't in the back seat of the economy anymore. It's saying, all right, we're going to get into the driving seat, because the past 40 years, the way we approached the economy has led to living standards and life expectancy flatlining. It's led to the return on wealth far outstripping the return on work. It's led to climate and natural world destruction. It's led to a public health crisis like obesity. It's saying that doesn't work anymore.
Well,
for this world, these choppier waters, we need a more active captain, and that's what this government's going to try and do.
Well, you mentioned public health, and we're going to move on and talk about COVID now, specifically the COVID inquiry, because as we were coming on air, the first report of the UK COVID inquiry was actually being delivered by the team there. We can speak now to our health correspondent, Sophie Hutchinson, who is outside the inquiry. Thanks for joining us, Sophie. So what have we learned in this report?
Well, Elizabeth, this is the report, 80,000 words, based on statements from nearly 70 witnesses and 100,000 documents. It is unflinchingly critical. Its conclusion is that citizens were failed, that the UK was ill-prepared for dealing with catastrophic emergencies, let alone a pandemic. It said the approach to risk assessments was flawed. There was a failure to learn from past outbreaks of diseases, and that there was what's known as groupthink, that narrow thinking when everybody is agreeing with each other, and that ministers failed to challenge that groupthink. It also said the UK planned for the wrong pandemic. They were planning for something mild or for influenza, and that's not what happened. And Baroness Hallett, the chair of this inquiry, has just spoken, and she said there will likely be another pandemic. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when, and potentially one even more transmissible and lethal.
OK, thank you, Sophie. So this is just the first stage of the COVID inquiry, just the first report. What do we expect to happen now? What happens next?
Well, the first thing that Baroness Hallett wants the government to start working on immediately in a timely fashion is implementing some of her 10 recommendations. These include the creation of a single independent statutory body to prepare and respond to UK-wide emergencies, rather than having lots of government departments preparing for emergencies. She wants a reliance on a much broader range of opinions and the inclusion of consideration of inequalities and vulnerabilities of different communities, and that the UK emergency response exercise, that a response exercise is taken on at least every 3 years. Now, the next stages for the inquiry are that in September, new sessions of evidence will be heard around the NHS and what happened in relation to COVID. And the next report to be published will be next year, and that is one focusing on the political decisions made.
OK, Sophie Hutchinson outside the COVID inquiry, thank you very much for joining us. And Sophie mentioned Baroness Heather Hallett there. We can hear a clip of her delivering part of her report now.
the UK prepared for the wrong pandemic. The significant risk of an influenza pandemic had long been considered, written about and planned for. However, that preparedness was inadequate for a global pandemic of the kind that struck. The institutions and structures responsible for emergency planning were labyrinthine in their complexity. There were fatal strategic flaws underpinning the assessment of the risks faced by the UK, how those risks and their consequences could be managed and prevented from worsening, and how the state should respond.
Baroness Heather Hallett, the chair of the COVID inquiry, there delivering part of her first report this morning. Chris, universally critical from what we've heard, from what Sophie just told us. This was on your government's watch, wasn't it? This lack of preparedness. What's your reaction to that report?
Well, I think we need to obviously study it very carefully and make sure the lessons are really carefully learned at the UK government level, but also, of course, the Welsh government, the Scottish government and the Northern Ireland executive are impacted significantly by the findings as well. And all of those governments at different levels need to, I think, react positively to this report and make the changes that it's recommending. Obviously, this report has taken evidence, it's considered it carefully. Clearly, they've had a chance to digest all of the facts and to consider the different arguments. Obviously, when it was happening in real time, there wasn't the time to do that. So I think it's really important that the government, both UK and the devolved administrations, learn from and implement the recommendations contained in this.
I mean, witnesses who spoke to the COVID inquiry were critical of the austerity years, and they pointed to that on its impact on all kinds of things, on public health, on our lab capabilities. You know, these are things which were overseen by your government.
Well, of course, as we're probably about to discuss, the NHS budget was exempted from the savings that were made in those Osborne-Cameron years, so the NHS itself was obviously protected. But there are clearly lessons that need to be learned. And one of the points they made was the reliance that ministers at the time took on a relatively small number of scientific advisors. And that was a really interesting point that I heard come through there, whether it's appropriate to have a small number of scientists and to have politicians essentially following their advice, or whether we need, firstly, a broader range of scientists offering potentially different advice, and then the politicians who are in charge, whether it's at the UK level or devolved administrations, able to take different or more balanced decisions with a wider range of input. Because this point about, you know, the groupthink amongst scientists and only one bit of scientific advice, when in fact it's very complicated and there are lots of different scientific opinions. It sounds like that didn't come through to ministers at the time.
So in relation to the expectation that it would be a flu pandemic. Angela, your reaction to what you've heard?
Well, I mean, the whole experience was horrific for many people, and many people lost their lives and lost their loved ones when perhaps if we'd have been better prepared, that wouldn't have had to happen. We've heard, and I'm sure the inquiry will carry on taking evidence about the pressures that were in the health service, but I think that the years of austerity had in fact reduced our resilience. And I think the thing that we have to look at is the best lessons to learn, because Baroness Hallett is correct. There's likely to be another pandemic sooner rather than later. It's not going to happen every 100 years anymore with some of the changes that are going on in the globe. And we have to make certain as a government whose first interest is to protect its people, that we've got some systemic structures involved that are going to help us respond.
And the Labour government is going to do that.
Well, the Cabinet Office and the Labour government will look at what these recommendations are. They've literally only just been published, but it would be irresponsible for any government now or in the future not to learn the lessons that this inquiry will be teaching us and to try to coordinate things. For example, the incoherence of the PPE procurements, which wasted literally billions of pounds. We must be better able to prepare for something like that in the future. And we know all about the VIP lane, of course.
So spot on. I was working as a doctor full-time at the pandemic in an A&E department, and the PPE guidelines would change almost every other day, right? And the reason would be the evidence is updating, but really you knew it was a supply chain problem, it was a stockpiling problem, and sure, the NHS was sort of separated from austerity, but we entered the pandemic with less beds, scanners and ventilators than virtually any comparable country, right? We re-diverted the entire hospital in which I was working on, focused on one disease which we didn't know how to treat. That was because we've ripped the resilience out of the health service in that decade from 2010, and that is why we were so underprepared. It's not going to surprise anyone in this country that we were underprepared for the pandemic because 200,000 people died, right? The thing that's surprising is that we thought we were prepared. That's the failure of the British state. We thought we were fine, and we approached it like a flu pandemic. So we relied on antivirals we didn't have. We relied on the assumption that you can't stop the spread of this until too late. And that's the failure we have to learn here, not just for dealing with future pandemics, but with extreme weather events, cyber attacks, any other crises that are coming around the corner, because they are coming around the corner. We need to learn the lessons of accountability.
And we'll find out from future things, but I think it's clear also that the government, from the very top down, were in two minds about how to deal with it in terms of what the best way to go was. And I think the system itself picked up that uncertainty. For example, also test and trace, spending billions on test and trace when we could have used the public health systems that were in place. I just never understood why that went on.
That's a really important point.
So I think you're right. There was uncertainty about the approach to take, and there were genuine debates that I wasn't participating in personally, but I heard about at the top of government, particularly in March 2020, and they didn't know whether to go for a sort of a hard lockdown and try and just put a firewall around the spread, or to have a sort of managed spread where the NHS was sort of protected to some extent. There were genuine uncertainties about how to handle that. That reflected a couple of things. It firstly reflected, I think, uncertainty in the scientific community, and it reflected uncertainty that flowed from the fact we hadn't seen anything like this, certainly for 100 years, and arguably the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920, roughly, was different in the sense that the world was much less globalised then. So this really was a sort of first time we'd ever encountered this as a society. And so it's not surprising that there were some real debates about, in the scientific community as well as the political community, about how to handle it. Now, what this report gives us a chance to do is obviously learn the lessons, but we should also be sufficiently sort of humble and self-aware to say that if something else happens, whether it's another pandemic, whether it's cyber attacks that you referred to, or something else, it's not going to be possible to foresee every kind of cataclysmic event that may confront us in the future. And we need to just sort of recognise that and make sure that we organise ourselves accordingly.
I think that's right, but just one point that is worth saying, you need the right experts, you need to ask them the right questions, you need to have the right diversity of experts.
And a range of experts, I think,
absolutely,
as well.
But you also need to make sure the buck stops with the politicians. Right? There's no point assuming responsibility in a democracy only to abdicate it when it really matters. These are political, moral, ethical decisions, and as representatives, the buck stops there. Like, that's where the accountability is, and we can't forget that. That's the key lesson I'm taking out of this.
But you do need to have a range of scientific opinion to do that, because if you only have a sort of single strand of scientific opinion, it's very difficult for any politician to disagree with that. That's why you need a diversity of scientific opinion to enable political leaders to make an informed choice.
You say that, but in fact, the idea of a lockdown, which turned out to be the one strategy the government really seemed to have, didn't come from the scientific advisors. Scientific advisors said, well, we would never have modelled that because it's such an extreme thing to do that we would never have modelled it unless the politicians had asked us to. And indeed, they didn't model it. And it came in because other countries were doing it with very little evidence that it would do the thing that we wanted to do. If you look back at the influenza plans, which were not fully implemented because the things that they said should be done in order to give us resilience were not done, it doesn't talk about lockdowns. It talks about whether it's worth closing schools and concludes that sometimes it might be, but it's really not clear. It talks about banning mass events. There's no idea that a lockdown would be a sensible thing to do. And in fact, although at the time everyone was saying, why haven't we got harder, earlier lockdowns? Now people are turning around and saying, oh, it turns out the impact of closing schools all those time was really, really terrible. Right. And in fact, there's been a great rise in antisocial behaviour and great corrosion of the fabric of society.
That's right.
And those of us who were saying at the time this is a very destructive policy, and you really need to think about whether this is proportionate and whether this is doing the right things.
Well, those
we're shouted down and we're said, how many people do you want to kill? Now people are saying, oh, actually, turns out a lot of this was very destructive and we still don't know the effects and the ramifications. And that was rushed into
but
by
I think that there are some
not
things,
on scientific advice, but because they didn't have anything else to do.
I think there are some things that, without knowing what the threat is, a state that's prepared can do. And some of that has got to be about investing in preparedness and resilience, and it's got to be about the structures that Baroness Hallett has talked about assembling, that gives us more of a chance to respond flexibly to whatever the next really, really serious threat that we're confronted with actually is. So there are some things we can do without getting into the theology of whether there should have been lockdowns or any of that is just sensible forward planning that we have to invest in, because the cost of viruses like this getting out into the global economy is trillions of pounds. And if as societies in the future we invest a little bit more in resilience across the globe, that means and that means also ensuring that you know, the weakest links in the global south that don't have health systems can also be protected. We're more likely to save ourselves from the colossal economic costs of a future pandemic, which will run into trillions, by a little bit of investment now. And that's what we should be thinking of doing as a global society.
We've got to make sure that system...
how much preparation you have, and I'm certainly not arguing that we did have it, because we didn't have it, and even the plans that were there were not implemented. But that doesn't save you if the government who's in power at the time don't actually calmly say, right, we're not going to be run by fear, we're not going to be run by panic, we're actually going to try and get the best advice we've got and try and work out a strategy that we think is the best strategy, and then have the courage to stand by it. And that is not what happened. We were run by panic and terrible decisions we made, releasing people into care homes from hospitals. One at a time. Of deaths.
One at a time.
And that was a deliberate government decision to empty the hospitals into the care homes, and it was clear that that would result in many, many deaths.
My point was that these are political decisions, and what we saw was quite weak leadership at that time. We saw this phrase, follow the science, again and again and again. And that was
abdicating
responsibility, because I've got a handful of experts here and I'm too scared to make this really big trade-off. Do I close schools or not? That is a massive question. You're trading currencies at an exchange rate you don't understand, and that's what governing in a crisis involves. And you have to be able to be quite clear on your moral and your ethical trade-offs, and then communicate and justify why you're making decisions.
So I think if you have a relatively small group of scientific advisors strongly advising a government, any government, to do something in a pandemic, it's quite hard for the government to disregard that advice. And that's why it's so important to have a plurality, a range of scientific advisors to give those different views.
And the government could have done that. It could have picked any advisor it wanted in the country, and they could have responded.
The point that you made earlier about, you know, the trade-offs between the damage done by a hard lockdown to society, to schools, actually to the health service ultimately as well, those are really sort of valid points. So more advice at the time to try and understand that better, I think, would have been really helpful. But we should also keep in mind what was happening at the time. You know, we saw in northern Italy hospitals overflowing, people dying in corridors, and we were being told we're 3 weeks behind that. So I think we should also just try to transport ourselves back.
The big elephant on the room at that point is that we had very long lockdowns,
really uncertain time.
I just want to ask this point, because moving on from the decision making at the time, moving forward, talking about the preparedness of the NHS, I'll just show you this headline from Tuesday in the Times. This is talking more NHS cash not feasible, advisor tells Labour. This is the story that Paul Corrigan, a former advisor to the Blair government, is coming in to help advise Wes Streeting, the new health secretary. And one of the points he's making is there isn't more money, hospitals should stop asking for money. Angela, how realistic is it that we can be more prepared if there isn't more money for hospitals?
Well, it depends what you're talking about being prepared about. I mean, in the context of the pandemic, that would be, resilience would be having stocks of PPE that you kept up to date. Resilience would be having contracts to get them, or even manufacturing, having a capacity that you could stand up to manufacture your own.
But that would require investment, wouldn't it?
But I mean, some of the things you have to do to create resilience are investments that pay off sometimes, but are there. If you cut those due to a period of austerity, if you have an NHS that has vast numbers of jobs that are vacant, puts more pressure and stress on everyone else. You have systems that mean that the resources that are being used inefficiently. So you've got to look to see how you can change some of that. Put the right kind of investment in, for example, so you can take account of every single slot in an operating theatre, so that you can deal with the 7.8 million waiting list that we've got now. So there is some redesign and restructure that you need.
There's a huge amount to digest here. So 80,000 words, and as I said, we just had it in the last kind of 25 minutes. So we'll go through it, and I'm sure it's something we'll come back to. There is a lot going on today. I'm going to take us now live to Oxfordshire because there is a big event going on at Blenheim Palace today. Sir Keir Starmer is hosting leaders from across Europe at the European Political Community meeting. And just a bit of background, you can see him meeting President Macron there of France. Just a bit of background on this, of course, the European Political Community is not part of the EU. It was something that was conceived by the French President, Emmanuel Macron, in 2022 after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as a way to include non-EU states like the UK in a wider circle of European countries. There is the Prime Minister with President Zelensky of Ukraine there. This was earlier this morning. We're going to go live to Blenheim Palace now, and our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman. Hello, Henry. Looks rather glorious behind you. What is this summit all about then?
Well, as you were saying, Elizabeth, this is a relatively new organisation, the European Political Community, only created at the instigation of France's President Macron 2 years ago in the wake of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And it's designed to foster unity across the European continent rather than just with EU leaders. Obviously, the UK is not in the EU. There's more than 40, almost 50 world leaders, or European leaders, I should say, here today. About half of them EU, but about half of them non-EU. And that makes it almost the perfect opportunity for Sir Keir Starmer, just 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, into his prime ministership, to carry out what he's been saying he believes this country needs for some time, which is a reset of the UK's relationship with Europe.
Right. And so what is Keir Starmer hoping to achieve today? There are lots of individual meetings going on, aren't there, as well as the sort of the big group photo that we were just looking at on our screens.
It's quite an unusual summit in that it's a bit more informal than something like a G7 or a G20. At summits like those, you expect the leaders to haggle over what's called a communique, something that they can, at the end of the summit, say, here you go, this is something to which we're all signed up. There's nothing like that coming out of today. No product, no document that they're all going to sign. Instead, this summit is almost all about what happens on the sidelines, about the discussions that Keir Starmer and other leaders have with each other. Of course, that's of a special significance for Keir Starmer because he just doesn't know a lot of these people yet at this point. But there is going to be some sessions this afternoon, and Keir Starmer has chosen to join the one on migration. That's being led by Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, someone who previous UK Prime Ministers have worked closely with on the issue of migration and asylum. And it will be very interesting to see what comes out of that.
OK, Henry at Blenheim Palace, thank you very much for joining us with that update. We're going to show you a headline from the Times now. It says EPC summit, Keir Starmer seeks new migrant deal in reset with EU. So as we heard from Henry there, Angela, the Prime Minister taking part in a discussion on migration today. He has said that border security will be at the heart of the government's reset with Europe. What does he mean?
Well, the issue of migration is cross-border by definition. You cannot tackle it simply at one end. You have to have a systemic way of tackling it, which deals with what's known as the downstream places, the places where people are coming from, so that you can communicate with them that they won't. It won't be easy for them to get into the country and earn a living here, because people smuggling gangs often sell their places on these boats as a kind of nirvana. And so what we have to do is have international cooperation across the European continent and beyond, so that we can deal with the problems of migration. Yes, with the French, obviously, and the previous government also did this, but also with other countries and what are known as transit countries, so that we can try to work to smash the people smuggling gangs and deal with the problem closer to source rather than deal with the outcome when the people smuggling has happened.
OK, but what is the new Labour government prepared to sign up to get these kinds of agreements with these other countries?
Well, what Sir Keir is doing, what the Prime Minister is doing, is establishing a dialogue about how we can best cooperate to deal with this particular pressure. For example, having more officers at Europol so we can communicate at that kind of level, setting up the new border security force so that we can cooperate cross-border to try to deal with what are internationally active, ruthless smuggling gangs who are making a great deal of money out of human misery. So some of it is about making certain that we can stop this at source, and that means international cooperation.
It's all about cooperation.
Well, of course, the previous government were doing everything that Angela just described. The National Crime Agency were working on smashing the criminal gangs. There was a deep cooperation deal with France. It goes back 3 or 4 years. There were deals with other countries, Albania, with Turkey, work going on in Bulgaria, right across the transit route. So everything Angela's describing was happening. Now, in terms of a deal to return people, which I think is what Sir Keir Starmer might be trying to discuss with the French and the Europeans more widely. Of course, he had one of those that could have been activated next week with Rwanda. He's cancelled that with no replacement and is now trying to frantically do a replacement deal with European countries. Ironically, many European countries themselves are looking at doing a Rwanda-style deal.
The Rwandan deal was a gimmick. They spent £250 million to get nobody to go to Rwanda. There's been 4 people gone to Rwanda voluntarily.
This is an absurd canard. So look, the Rwanda deal was supposed to start next week. It hadn't even started. The first flight was due to take off on as your officials will probably brief you, was due to take off on the 24th of July next week. So the Rwanda plan was never actually implemented because it was cancelled by the Labour government.
It was a gimmick, it was a gimmick which would never
let me answer the point. So hang on, let me answer the point. So it wasn't a gimmick. And let me give you 2 reasons why it's not a gimmick. First of all, the Australian government about 10 years ago did something very similar which worked as part of what they called Operation Sovereign Borders. Secondly, we had a returns agreement with Albania that was activated about a year and a half ago. That worked as well. So we've got 2 clear case studies showing that a Rwanda-style arrangement works, but the Labour government cancelled it, and now they're frantically trying to find a replacement.
No, I mean, the Albanian decisions are about returning Albanian citizens. The Rwandan deal is about taking anyone who arrives on a small boat.
Which is the same as the Australian.
Which is the same as the Australian.
Hold on.
I am loath to get into the Rwanda deal, but Angela is right. It was unworkable. Not only did it have so many constitutional issues of trying to pass that law, which had to be rewritten 3 or 4 or 5 times, it still wouldn't have worked.
It worked in Australia.
That flight would not have worked.
It did work in Australia.
Anyway, look, the point here, and this is the difference between the previous government and this government, is that the mood music in Blenheim Palace is going to be really different, right? This is a reset of the tone. This is an attempt to show Britain is reconnected. We're not adversarial. We're here to collaborate on transnational challenges, right? Transnational challenges that include organised crime around immigration, but transnational challenges that mean Russia, 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 right?
Okay.
Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, Russia's threat to national security, Russia's problems on energy security. That requires collaboration, not just within the EU, but between the 45 countries that are there in Winston Churchill's ancestral home. And that's what the conversation is going to be about today.
Yeah. Tamandra, is there something in this idea of mood music and there being a bit of a reset? There is something in it, in that at the last one of these summits, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, wouldn't take part in a migration conversation with Rishi Sunak because of the line that the British government was taking, or some of the hints that were being made about the European Court of Human Rights. Is there something in that, in just the mood being a little bit different?
Well, I'm sure there is, because Keir Starmer famously was anti-Brexit, and I think didn't he at one point campaign for a second referendum to give people a chance to vote again and vote different. But So that will obviously set a different mood. Now, in terms of adversarial, I have to say, I think a lot of the adversarial music has come from the EU since Brexit, because obviously they don't want to be seen to encourage other countries to have the same idea. So they're bound to make it difficult. So having Keir Starmer in may give them an elegant way to say, OK, now, well, we're going to be more friendly and more relaxed. And no doubt Keir Starmer himself will be keen to have closer relationships. I have to say, though I also think the Rwanda plan was ridiculous and inhumane, most of the European countries and the EU itself are looking, and indeed already doing, similar plans, not only sending people back, but setting up camps in places like Libya and preventing migrants from coming. So it's not like the EU has this lovely, fluffy, humane attitude to people that want to move there. There's a lot of equally ruthless. Can I just finish? There's a lot of. Can I just finish my sentence, way of doing it? There's a lot of equally ruthless attitudes to people who want to move to Europe that is enacted by the EU and by EU member countries. So, let's look to them as a lovely, fluffy, welcoming harbour in contrast to the way Britain has been behaving.
Angela, I mean, this continues. It was a troubling subject for the last government. It continues to be a difficult issue for your government. We've got record numbers of migrants coming on these small boat crossings. I think 1,000 migrants have arrived in the UK since the few short weeks that you have been in government. This is something that you are going to have to deal with. And how are you going to do it?
Well, we're going to try to smash the people smuggling gangs by establishing the Border Security Force. We're going to, as we've said in our manifesto, legislate to give them wider powers, which were akin to the anti-terrorism powers, and we're going to cooperate and be effective at a national crime agency level.
How long do you think it will take?
Well, you can't flick a switch and stop people being exploited by criminal gangs. You have to do the hard graft of creating the right structures to do it in the border control command, and then you've got to cooperate with your partners in the countries through which these people are coming to try to put a stop to the infrastructure which is smuggling them. It's absolutely the case that no country can allow criminal gangs to decide who comes here. We have to decide if and when we want immigration ourselves. So that is something that we have to do. It's not about gimmicks, expensive gimmicks like Rwanda. It's about the hard, difficult, daily grind of cooperating with other people, law enforcement, anti-terrorism, to deal with the people who are exploiting very vulnerable people. And that is what we're going to do.
But the truth is, the work that Angela's described, which is all very sensible, has been happening for the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, I saw it myself when I was doing Angela's job about 2 or 3 years ago. The work with the National Crime Agency, their network of international liaison officers, deals with countries like France and Albania, cooperation with Turkey, Bulgaria, the whole of route work, the cooperation, the intelligence cooperation with Germany, the work with the Belgian police, all of that stuff which Angela's described. It's all very sensible. But it's being done already. And if Angela and her colleagues think that basically just sort of changing the name on the door is going to change the result, it won't. It's going to require more than that. And look, I hope it succeeds. But the truth is, it's been done over the last 3 years.
The existence of the Rwanda scheme did not deter anybody from coming.
That's because it hadn't started, had it?
When you first legislated for it, you said just legislating for it would be a deterrent.
All right. All right, we're going to leave that there now.
Parliament is not going to solve this issue.
We're going to go to an even more febrile political environment. We're going to head to the United States and have a look at this headline from the BBC News website. Biden under new pressure from top Democrats as COVID halts campaign. This is the news that President Biden apparently has contracted COVID. He has mild symptoms, according to the White House. Further two senior Democrats in the US Congress, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Majority Leader Hakeem Jeffries are both reported to have told the president that they think it is time for him to move on. Nancy Pelosi, the former House Speaker, has also privately told him, apparently, that he should step down. And you contrast that with these pictures we can see now from the Republican conference in Milwaukee. These pictures just from last night. former President Trump there, you can see almost rejuvenated following that assassination attempt. You see that fist in the air again. Triumphant, you might call it. Tamandra, do you think Joe Biden, it's time for him to step back?
Well, really, the question the Democrats should be asking themselves is, why did we put him there in the first place? I mean, maybe they have very, very little choice, being as he's already president, but that in the whole of the Democrat Party, you can't find someone who is a better opponent to Donald Trump in an election is really pretty damning, isn't it?
I guess the strangeness here is that you're talking about, in policy terms, in legislative terms, the most successful American president since the war, right? But now he is an electoral liability to people on his own side, is what they are saying. So there's a real strangeness there, and democracy in politics isn't about what happened yesterday. It's about what happens tomorrow.
But do you think that the success of his administration so far is down to him as a leader? Is it not down to the fact that he followed Trump, so there was a contrast? They were coming out of the pandemic, so they had favourable economic conditions.
No, I think that's probably unfair.
Do you really think that President Biden, as a leader, is responsible for all the things that he's taking credit for?
I think we should give him credit for the past 4 years. I think that should not mean voters in America should be deferential and be like, well, he did a good job then, he's going to do a good job in the next 4 years.
But the real question is, why is there not a pool of talented Democrats that they're looking and saying, well, we've got all these options. Who are the other options? The Democrats really seem to take their voters for granted. I mean, when they put Hillary Clinton up, who was very unpopular against Trump, and you thought, well, they've managed to find someone who can lose to Donald Trump, and yet they seem to have not learned from that. They seem to not learn that they actually need to earn the trust and the support of the voters.
I think that's a good point. What makes a good representative in democracy today? The fact that someone like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance can resonate so deeply with such parts of America, and people on the other side, on the progressive side, are struggling to do that. That is a more demanding version of democracy. It's not just about delivering your policy promises. It's about showing that you're one of us, as a Maloney line, that there's people that you have to represent people as well as deliver your promises. And that's a good warning sign and a lesson to learn for British government.
Yeah, well, speaking of the British government, there's a lesson there. A lot of the things Biden has been able to deliver are popular, and yet he, as an individual, is struggling.
Well, I mean, we've been in office for 2 weeks, so I think it's
not
a
worried
bit
about
early
that.
to ask questions like that.
Also, Keir Starmer has a few years on... Joe Biden has a few years on Sir Keir Starmer,
yes, that's true,
somewhat.
although I think he is the same.
Should he stand down,
Jagger.
though?
What Biden is?
Yes.
Well, the stark contrast. Should President Biden step back?
That's a matter for the Democrats in America. I'm not going to comment.
Well, I mean, she's right, obviously. It is a matter for the Democrats. But it's rather sad to see that President Biden is obviously not in great shape. And I sort of feel for him and for his family. It's obviously a huge responsibility to serve in the American presidency. And even for much younger people, that burden really takes its toll. Just look at pictures of Barack Obama before and after his presidency. So I do feel for Joe Biden personally and for his family.
Do you think there's a sort of an inevitability now to somebody else having to take over, Tamandra?
I think so, and I think the noises are starting to... You said Pelosi told him privately, so it's not that private, it's on the BBC. And I think he is starting to, again, give himself elegant ways out, saying, oh, well, if doctors tell me. So I think maybe he is starting to concede that it...
Do you think a Trump victory is inevitable, even if there is a change of...
I don't think anything in politics is inevitable, but I think the Democrats are going to have to do something pretty remarkable to overcome that.
Remarkable path?
Yeah, that's potentially true. It's not for us to speculate on this. It is worth saying that the sort of Foreign Secretary today was quite skillfully started building a relationship with J.D. Vance way before he was Foreign Secretary. So, I mean, foreign policy and diplomacy isn't based on cancel culture. The UK government will have to work with whatever presidency is in America.
Which is striking, considering David Lammy has had some choice words for our friends across the pond.
And J.D. Vance has had some choice words for Donald Trump.
Except J.D. Vance has retracted them. David Lammy hasn't.
Right.
Well, we'll find out soon.
we will. That is all for today. Thank you to all of my guests. Joe Coburn will be back with you on Monday with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. Goodbye from me. Bye-bye.